Hello again and welcome to the Gospel of Luke. We're in our second program of a 26-week series, and last week we were able to cover the major themes. I'd like to introduce, though, the guests who are here today, as they were last week. To my left is Dr. Robert Maldonado, a professor at California State University, Fresno for the last 22 years, and a New Testament scholar. And across from me, Reverend Dr. Garner Odell, a former professor of New Testament studies at the San Francisco Theological Seminary and an interim intentional minister in the Presbyterian tradition. We want to thank our scholars for being here again. And I want to ask Robert and Garner, why are you here? Why did you decide you would be interested in doing a sharing on the Gospel of Luke?
Well,
Luke, it's not your favorite.
It's not, I should make full disclosure. It's not my favorite, but it actually is how I came to biblical studies. I actually did my master's thesis on Luke, and I incorporated a bit of Lucan material in my doctoral dissertation, which maybe is what killed it for me. but I'm now, a quarter of a century on, and so I'm actually I haven't really focused a lot on Luke since then, other than when I teach it in my classes, and so I don't always do Luke, and so I'm actually quite excited to be back.
So glad you signed on, Robert. Garner, what made you want to come back and share on Luke?
Well, I love Bible study, and for me it's exciting, and I love the mysteries of it, of trying to dig behind the Word and find what that meaning is for my life. And if I can help somebody else get involved in a similar kind of study, that's wonderful.
Well, I'm really glad you joined us again as you did last year. Greg, let's begin with those 15 themes of Luke. Let's put them up very quickly and let's see what we have. It's a conversion gospel. There's a journey motif. It's filled with prayer. The Holy Spirit is on every page. There's a real outreach in Luke to the outsiders. Shared meals are all over the place. There's a call for detachment from possessions from the disciples. Suffering and rejoicing in Jesus' name is a leitmotif that Luke plays up big. The risen Lord, according to Luke, is going to be experienced through the breaking of the bread, the Word, and shared possessions. Theophilus is the one who receives the message in both of these books, Luke and Acts. Salvation is the major motif or goal. Women play a big role. The history of salvation, we'll talk about it later. Luke has a very interesting understanding of Hebrew Scriptures leading into the New Testament, leading into the future of the church's ministry. Fulfillment, or God's will fulfilled, God's promises fulfilled, and everything done in a joyful spirit. This is the Lucan flavor. On that note, let's begin with Luke, and that would be Garner sharing with us some insights into the prologue, the first four verses. What do you have?
The prologue, or the first 4 verses of the Gospel of Luke, are kind of Luke telling us why he's doing this and where he gets his information. And I'm going to be reading a few verses from Eugene Peterson's translation called The Message. Luke says, "So many others have tried their hand at putting together a story of the wonderful harvest of Scripture and history that took place among us, using reports handed down from the original eyewitnesses who served this word with their very lives. Since I have investigated all the reports in close detail, starting from the story beginning, I decided to write it all out for you, most honorable Theophilus, so you can know beyond the shadow of a doubt the reality and the reliability of what you were taught." So he talks about he's using the eyewitness accounts, he's using his own research, and he's writing to somebody to heighten their understanding of the gospel.
What else is left there, Robert, in that prologue?
Well, as an historian, there's a whole bunch of really interesting things, and maybe theologically too. First, just to say a little bit about Theophilus. which we said last time we don't know a lot about. But the name is actually a fairly common name in the Roman Empire. Theophilus means God lover or friend of God. Theo, where we get theology, and Philos, Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. And so Theophilus can be an actual person, in which case he would likely be Luke's patron. Historians were supported by wealthy patrons, and so this could be the person whom Luke is sort of writing for. It's also possible that it's simply a symbolic name, so that anybody who is a lover of God is being invited into this journey. And of course, both of those are not mutually exclusive. It could refer to an actual person, whether it's a patron or not, and it can also have the symbolic sort of general meaning for anybody who is interested in that.
Why is the excellent, most excellent added onto the
Well,
name?
that's a title that was used for leaders,
Okay.
and Luke actually uses it, I think, 3 times in the Acts of the Apostles with respect to Roman governors. And so many have speculated, based on that it's not necessarily those characters that Luke is writing to, but that Luke is writing to somebody of that level.
Okay. So there are a number of possibilities.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's consistent with sort of the patron, higher Roman official kind of thing. The other thing that I think is really interesting about this prologue is the two dominant, you may remember from the Mark show, the two dominant views of how the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are related to each other have either Matthew or Mark being first. The vast majority think Mark was first, but a minority think Matthew was first. And so in all of the major dominant theories about the relationships, Luke is using somebody else. Luke is either using Matthew or Luke is using Mark, and maybe other Q material, as we talked about last time. And so what's interesting to me about this opening is that Luke is basically saying he doesn't think those are good enough, right? Because you have these Theophilus, but they don't get you to the truth. Mine is going to get you to the truth. And so I've always found that intriguing, because the gospel writers seem to not think the other gospels were that.
He wanted it orderly,
Yes,
as if
yes,
like the others are kind of all over the place,
Right.
but mine's orderly.
And it will get you to the truth. Yeah.
The truth. Now that's a big word there. That concept of the truth, certainty. Is there one final thought about that? That Greek word is asphales or something. That is certainty, absolute gospel truth here.
Yeah. I think that's enough.
Sort of like, this is serious stuff that Luke's wanting us to have. He wants you to believe it so you'll die for it, because this is truth.
I think also we need to say that the indication is that Theophilus already knows something of this story. And it's almost as though Luke is saying, I'm going to add to your education, or I'm going to change a few things and make you think about it again. So he's not writing to somebody who has never heard this story before.
And what we're going to see in Luke is that there is a lot of Lucan material that is peculiar to Luke, so that there is something that he's giving that is not even a parallel text to the other fellas, okay? That's kind of interesting to note, that there are so many passages, such as chapter 1 of Luke, that's Lucan. So we got to give Luke a lot of kudos here. Of which we bring up another passage for Robert to kind of unpack for us, the promise of the Baptist's birth. Where would you like to highlight that one, Robert?
Well, there's several things to do with the birth of John. One is to focus on how Luke is working to situate this story in relation to the Jewish context, and unlike later with the stereotypes that I mentioned last time that Luke will indulge in, here he presents the characters as sort of ordinary, some special, but still practicing Jews who are participating in the history of God's people. And it's also quite interesting how the promise of John the Baptist gets linked both to Elijah explicitly, and in terms of the restoration that Elijah is going to do with families, but also implicitly with Samuel. And that's a little harder to see initially, but I think it's really important, and it's going to get picked up with the Magnificat and other things later with Hannah's song, although that's on the lips of Mary, but I'll say more about that later. And I think it's important to see how Luke is highlighting Samuel and John the Baptist, because Samuel, you may remember, is a transitional figure from the time of the judges in preparation for the time of the monarchy and King David, ultimately Saul first, but then David's monarchy. And I think Luke is trying to present John the Baptist in a very similar role, namely that he is sort of culminating the time of the judges, the previous prophets, the previous traditions, but also a transition. He is not the end point. He is also the transition to the new king, who is going to be, of course, Jesus. And so I think the Elijah Samuel motif is one of the most important ones for thinking about John the Baptist.
Now, speaking of kings, the very sentence, verse 5, in the days of Herod, king of Judea, how important is it that Luke puts some, like a historical setting almost often? He seems to want to situate it historically.
Well, certainly there's that, but I also think Luke is doing a whole bunch of really interesting things by comparing sort of the world's powers and God's powers. He does that sort of with Herod here, and in many ways this is quite interestingly connected to Matthew, because we sing well, first just to say, again, Luke and Matthew have very different infancy stories. Luke has the shepherds and the Annunciations, and Matthew has the wise men and the Bethlehem stuff. But we sing the song of the three kings, which does a major disservice, because Matthew really is focusing on two kings in contrasting the sort of bad, false King Herod with the true King Jesus, so that there's, we really make a mistake when we say we three kings of Orient are, and because I think it deflects from what Matthew wants. And I actually think that Luke is setting up actually a fairly similar motif here by contrasting the false King Herod with the true king, who is going to be the one coming after the new Samuel, which is John the Baptist. And then later he's going to do a similar thing with the emperor. The Roman emperor.
It's a lot more than just setting up a historical perspective.
I mean, he's certainly locating it in time and space, but he's also doing a rather sophisticated critique of the pretensions of human power and what we think of as sort of the ordinary authorities and powers of the world.
This would indicate to me that he really was more of a skilled thinker and writer than sometimes is thought of these men that wrote in the Gospels in the New Testament.
Absolutely, I think so. They are sophisticated, and it's not even just them writing too, because I think most of the Gospels, including Luke, were probably performed in their congregations. And so the actual composition of these texts are performance pieces that are, I think, revised in the practice. And so it's very difficult to really talk about authors. I find this in my classes because we are so conditioned in the modern world to think of authors as, the individual who takes up their pen and hides up in their attic or whatever and writes the great American novel or something. And certainly there is an author, Luke, I think, whoever that was, who is doing a lot of the composition. But I also think all of the Gospels are corporately composed.
Now, there's still a lot of the oral tradition that fits in with this too.
Absolutely.
We've got to take our break at this point, but please don't go far. We'll be back in 1 minute to continue our study of chapter 1 of the Gospel of Luke.
KNXT thanks all its loyal viewers and respected businesses who have supported your Catholic television station. Now you can support KNXT with program underwriting by having your name, your company's name, or organization associated with your favorite program. Detailed information about you or your company will appear before and after each program or day part you select. Keep the quality and spiritual message alive and make a difference. Call 559-488-7440 today or go online at knxt.tv to find out more about program underwriting on KNXT.
Welcome back to our second program, the second half of the second program on the Gospel of Luke. We're up to a text that is well known, I think, to all of us. It's the Annunciation. It's going to be verses 26 to 38 of chapter 1 of Luke. I wonder what initial thoughts, Garner, you may want to just share anything, maybe something Eugene Peterson offers, something that your own commitment to this passage. Where would you say we need to know something about this passage? If there's one thing, what is it?
Well, the first thing that strikes me about this passage is that Luke seems to be very careful about setting the stage, place, time, the marriage or the betrothal between, and so he seems to be very careful in setting that stage before he gets into the actual meat of this passage. And again, I think it's interesting that Mary is greatly troubled by this, even though, and we don't know why, whether it's because she's in this year-long betrothal period before marriage, or whether it was just a very strange happening that came to her. But she was reassured, and she seems to, again, question this. How will this be? And it's interesting that when Zechariah was told that Elizabeth was to have a child, he questioned it too, and he was struck dumb. So there's an interesting passage there.
Oh, yeah.
And so then in the end, I think it's a beautiful thing that Mary and Elizabeth get together and compare notes, and with these wonderful births that are going to take place. So I think it's a lovely passage, and it has a very human element to it, of Mary's response and Elizabeth's response, and it's just quite lovely.
What we'll do at this point is look at the very last passage we needed to cover for today, which is Mary's visit to Elizabeth, the Magnificat, which would be Luke 1, 39 to 56, and have Robert, in a sense, help us appreciate the depth of the Magnificat, and then if we have any time left, we'll be able to figure out some loose ends from the rest of this chapter that we've looked at perhaps more quickly than we wished. Robert.
Well, in doing that, I would tie it back to something Garner just said. You know, he mentioned how the Annunciation to Mary has parallels with Zechariah along with differences, and that's also how Luke is embedding this in the broader tradition, because these patterns of Annunciations are actually built on the Annunciations that are in the Hebrew Bible, the ones of the births of Ishmael and Isaac and well, those are the main ones. And so that's all being tied together. And then you get this wonderful episode of Mary and Elizabeth, right, with the baby in Elizabeth's womb leaping at the meeting of Mary, and sort of, again, John the Baptist is already doing his thing, right? He's already announcing and doing this transition to the new king, right? The prediction in Gabriel's Annunciation to Mary is that he will be the Son of God, which of course we take very theologically today, But its primary meaning in this period and earlier, certainly in the Hebrew Bible, the Son of God was the King. And so again, that ties it together to the transition of John the Baptist. Now, the intriguing thing about the Magnificat, and here I'll just put on my Bible scholar hat because I know the Magnificat is so deeply tied to Mary, but in some manuscripts it simply says, "and she said," which would make it Elizabeth's speech. And in many ways, I think that's probably the more correct in who Luke might have intended to be the speaker of the Magnificat. Because again, excuse me, the Magnificat actually is the thing that is building on Hannah's song back in 1 Samuel 2, I think. And again, that makes much more sense to me relating the Samuel identity to John the Baptist, because the Samuel identity doesn't match to Jesus very well. And so to have Elizabeth be the speaker of the Magnificat, I think, is probably what Luke intended. But obviously that's not the way it's come down to us.
Now let's stay on that one, because that one is like worth digging in on. I do have the translation in the RSV, "and Mary said," but you're saying that on another text translation, it doesn't put Mary's name, but she said. Yeah. So at another time, someone interpolated Mary. Maybe.
No.
Interesting. And not just interesting like, yeah, but like, where does that go? It would really make a different understanding of our whole understanding of Christ and of the person of Mary, because we suddenly appreciate Elizabeth and John the Baptist a little bit differently.
Right. And of course, Magnificat is about God more than it's about John or Jesus, right? So the issue here is the identity of the speaker relative to Hannah in the Old Testament, but it's also still connected to Jesus, right? Because Jesus, as the Son of God, is going to continue the activity of God in the reversals, which is the other really important thing to mention in the Magnificat, because the Magnificat, I think, is really important, whoever is speaking it, because it highlights some very important and fundamental themes of Luke, which we mentioned before, namely this reversal of roles, right? Which is again drawing explicitly on 1 Samuel 2, very similar poem in Hannah's song, another barren woman who receives a son after some prayer. So the rich are, the poor are the recipients of God's favor now. They were on the outs, but now they are being restored, and the rich are being sent away empty. And it's not, it's really interesting to me how we have a tendency to keep talking about, we have to be good stewards of our wealth and such and such and such. But in the Gospels, the problem really is wealth. It's almost as if the implication is, the rich are rich, they got their due, but now they're not. They're out unless you actually become poor. And there is no way to be rich without exploiting the poor. Luke and Jesus almost seem to be saying.
That's where I'm really glad that Robert just said that thing. That seems to be what Luke and Jesus are saying. Jesus and Luke seems to come out. And Luke, when he has a chance, seems to be playing up a tune of such turning the tables on the culture that it is, that those that are high and mighty will no longer be so. And those that are underneath, they will be brought up. It's rather a very countercultural message in this polarized society that we live in. This is a very shocking, I think, message.
Yeah, it's pretty much an inversion of the social ladder.
Yeah.
And Luke knows that, I'm sure.
With regard to women, with regard to, a lot of the disenfranchised of the Jewish community at that time.
There's one line that I'd like us to talk about, and Greg has a picture of it, really beautiful. It's line 50 of the Magnificat, verse 50, and his mercy is on those who fear him from generation to generation. Greg, can you show us the street that Luke seems to be constructing his gospel on? It's at the corner of mercy and grace. Robert and then Garner, can you unpack maybe that sign as to why it is a really interesting geographic signpost for the message of Luke?
Well, I think it's important that Luke does this because, again, this radical reversal is certainly nothing that's easy. And whatever judgment there is in terms of failure, not keeping it, is tempered by mercy, right? It's God's mercy is still sort of a dominant element. So there's that's not a license to just take it, but I think it's important that it's a harsh, difficult theology that is not expecting just perfection at the very beginning, but fear.
Before I give Garner a last chance to say something before the close of the show, I do have to advise you that all of the programs of Channel 49, or many of them, English, Spanish, Portuguese, and Hmong language programs, are now readily acceptable or accessible at our YouTube channel. Just go into knxt.tv and you will find, or at youtube.com, KNXT1, all of these programs. All of Mark is there, all 26 episodes, and many of our programs. So please join us on the YouTube. Garner, you have 30 seconds of a final thought.
Well, my thought on that sign is that they have to go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. And when it's almost as when we present mercy to the disenfranchised, that is grace coming through us from God.
Hail Mary, full of grace. We know this is our prayer, and we know that Luke, more than any other gospel writer, is going to be giving us a message of mercy, forgiveness, healing, salvation, and all of this, week by week, we hope to be unpacking. Garner just threw in joy. It is the theme that we want to be looking at next week when we see you again. Till then, God bless.